So today in class, we talked about adjectives. Adjectives are words that describe nouns. And so for a quick example, if I have a dog, I could describe him with any number of adjectives. He could be a Roman dog. And if it's a boy dog, of course, I'm going to use Romanus. But he could also be a brave dog. And I could say Fortis Canis. He could also be a quiet dog, right? Quietus Canis. Or a sad dog. Tristis Canis. And any of these adjectives on this page could probably describe my dog. And these adjectives on this vocab list that you guys were practicing with are exemplifying the two different kinds of adjectives that exist in Latin. They're not all that different. It's just the ones on the left go us, in order to describe masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns. Some of them go Go back to this. So I think at the bottom we have like kind of like puer, right? Not all of our masculine nouns end in us, for example, and so our adjectives have this option as well. But the feminine is still and the neuter is still So us, or Those are one type of adjectives. Again, the us or for masculine, the for feminine, and the for neuter, depending on what the noun is we're describing. So let's look at three different examples of nouns: a feminine noun like puella, a masculine noun like lupus, and a neuter noun like theatrum. Now let's use a different animal that was recently in our story. Anser, our goose. Technically, he's a gander, right? Because he's a male goose, but goose is our English vernacular. So puella is feminine, anser is masculine, and theatrum is neuter, for example. Or let's go back to our canis, because that's easier, I guess. It doesn't really matter that puella is first declension, or that canis is third declension, or that theatrum is second declension. These are examples of a feminine noun, a masculine noun, and a neuter noun. And so if I had a Roman girl, she'd be a puella romana. But if I had a Roman boy dog, he'd be a canis romanus. And if I had a Roman theater, it'd be a theatrum romanum, using that neuter ending. Any adjective can describe any noun, but we have to make sure they're the same gender. But we have to do more than just make sure they're the same gender. We have to make sure that they're the same gender, number, and case. And so if I had a puella mala, I don't know, or a canis, masculine malus, or I just built a bad theater, right? Theatrum malum. But let's say I wanted it to be in the dative case, right? I make puellae dative, and then I have to make the adjective dative too. I make canis dative, blank se, and then I make malus, us-eo, dative too. And I make theatrum, eo, neuter, dative, and I make malum, also dative, right? So I always make sure that whatever adjective is describing my noun, that I make sure they're the same gender, right? Masculine, feminine, or neuter, the same number, singular or plural, right? But also the same case. So if I see my mom, that makes her accusative. Let's say I greet my mom, right? Saluto. I greet mom. Mom's accusative. She's also singular and feminine. And if I say I greet my happy mother, right? I'd make her laita because she's a girl, but I'd also make it accusative, okay? So that's the purpose of today's lesson. But our other type of adjectives over here on the right-hand side don't go us, Most of them go a. Again, masculine, feminine, and neuter, but the masculine and feminine forms do happen to be identical. These adjectives and these adjectives aren't just different by the us, and the is, but what that signifies is that the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms of this adjective are borrowing their endings from the first declension for feminine, from the second declension for masculine and neuter, right? That looks like a second declension ending. That looks like a second declension ending. That's just where their endings come from. So we can call them first/second declension adjectives, or some people like to call them 2-1-2 adjectives, borrowing their masculine endings from the second declension, their feminine endings from the first declension, and their neuter endings from the neuter second declension. Okay, and these guys over here that go is, a, where the masculine and feminine look the same and the neuter is different, they borrow their endings from the third declension. And that's it, right? It's just we're borrowing endings. And so when fortis needs to be turned into the accusative case, I go blank em, right? I would get fortem. Whereas when tuus needs to be made accusative, I go eo and I get tuum. Okay, so we've got this type of adjective and this type of adjective. They can describe any noun. So fortis, I don't care that it's a third declension adjective. All that means is its endings come from the third declension. It can describe a first declension noun. That's totally cool, right? As long as when I make that noun accusative, for example, I make this guy accusative too. They're always going to match in gender, number, and case. So our notes page from class today recapped a couple of things. We looked at the top at an example of a 2-1-2, or a first/second declension adjective, right? Borrowing those us, and endings for masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns. And we also looked at tristis as our example of a third declension adjective that goes tristis for masculine, tristis for feminine, and triste for neuter. And we know our first and second declension endings, so we went ahead and filled them out to be safe, right? I, arum, is, as, is, masculine, us, o, orum, is, os, is, right? That's our second declension endings. And our neuter forms are just a little bit, right? It's o, and orum, is, okay? Those are not new. Those are our first and second declension endings. We're just borrowing them for the us, forms of this adjective. And this guy is borrowing third declension endings over here, right? Blank, is, em. We would expect if it were a noun, but the adjective gets a tiny tweak, so we get blank, is, em, As, ibis, as, ibis. And for neuter, blank, is, blank, again, right? Our nominative and our accusative have the same ending, so is, and then ibis, ibis. Again, those are based on our first and second declension noun endings, right? If you know your first declension endings, your second masculine and second neuter, that's a 2-1-2 adjective. And if you know your third declension noun endings, we're just tweaking them a teeny tiny bit to get our third declension adjective endings. Instead of the short e that we just saw here for our noun, we get a long I on our adjective. And instead of just we get and instead of just we get ia for those neuter, nominative, and accusative plurals, okay? So based on your first, second declension endings and based on your third declension endings. So then we looked at an example sentence. I love my dog, right? Canem amo. Dog is accusative here because it's the direct object. And let's just assume it's a masculine dog. So if I wanted to use my, right, I would go to the masculine form of my, meus, and I'd make it accusative, singular, to describe this dog, and I would get meum. But with sad, which borrows its endings from the third declension, I take my masculine tristis and make it accusative and get tristem. Both of these words describe canem. Tristem does happen to be using the same declension endings as canis, which is third. So because they both happen to be third, we get the same ending. This guy happens to be first/second, or second for masculine. And so it gets a slightly different ending. But as long as they're all accusative, singular, and masculine matching canem, we are good to go. Okay, so I made canem accusative, it's singular and masculine. I made meus, which is singular and masculine accusative, and I made tristis accusative as well. Meum, tristem, canem, amo. I love my sad dog. And so we did all of these things with my and sad as our adjectives. So in this one, in my sad fields, to be curve plaka. Do you like to run in my sad fields? And fields here are plural, fields are masculine. And in this specific sentence, they are ablative because of the word in, right? In takes the ablative. So then I went to the masculine meus, made it ablative plural and got meis. And I went to the masculine tristis and made it ablative plural and got trist ibis, right? Meus gave me meis and tristis gave me tristibus for ablative plural, tristibus on there. Okay, for mater, right? Mater is feminine, of course, and singular. And here she's accusative because it's like, I love mom, direct object. So we take the feminine form mea and make it accusative meam. And we take the feminine form tristis and make it accusative and get tristem. We did the same thing for I visit friends, right? They're plural, they're accusative because they're the direct object, and of course they're masculine. So I take meios and make it accusative plural and get meos. And I take tristis and make it accusative plural and I get tristes. Meos, tristes, both describe amicos. And the pattern that should be emerging to you is that if your noun happens to be first or second declension, then the first or second declension adjective describing it is going to share the same ending most of the time. And if your noun happens to be third declension, and you got a third declension adjective describing it, they're going to happen to have the same ending most of the time, okay? And again, amicus, second declension, so meios being a first/second declension adjective looks the same. Tristis is third, it doesn't look the same, but I am matching in case, number, and gender, or in order of, like, I start with the gender of the noun, of course the number is kind of implied, singular or plural, and then I get the right case for it as well, right? So I start with a masculine us, a feminine or a neuter or a masculine is, a feminine is, or a neuter a, and then I make it the appropriate case, right? Ablative is, accusative accusative plural os, right? Just depending on whether I'm using an us a adjective or an is a adjective. I always start with the gender of the noun, the number, and the case of the noun, and the adjective won't necessarily look like it, but as long as it's the same gender, number, and case, I am good to go. We did a few more examples. We said they sell a book. They sell my sad book, so it's accusative. Books are masculine, and it's singular here. So I took the masculine meios and made it accusative, and I took tristis and made it accusative and got tristem. And the last two that we'll look at, if I climb trees are feminine, they're plural, and here they're accusative, right? And if I climb my sad trees, I just make my feminine meia, also accusative plural meios, and my feminine tristis, also accusative plural tristes. In the next sentence, if I send my sad letters, letters are also feminine plural and accusative, right? They're first declension, where arbores was third, but I don't care what declension they are. I care what gender, number, and case they are. And since both of these words are feminine plural and accusative, I got the same forms of the adjectives, right? The feminine plural accusative meios and the feminine plural accusative tristes. So that's all we're doing here. We're making our adjective, whether it's an us a adjective or an is a adjective, be the same case, number, and gender as the noun it is describing. Your homework is a similar activity, right? It's a worksheet that looks a lot like this. I think it's this guy here. It's got the Lego fellow on there. Same thing, right? I love my sad friends. Make it the same case, number, and gender as amicos, right? You're using your us a or your us endings here, and you're using your third declension endings for this guy. That's all. Wale.